Hi, my name is Adrian, and welcome to the Consulting Academy. Today, we're going to cover the best way you can open a case interview. If you haven't already, please check out our previous episode on what is the case interview and how you could do well in it. Last episode, we talked about how there are three components in a case interview: the opening, the analysis, and the closing. Today, we're specifically going to focus on the opening. As we said earlier, the opening is one of the most important parts of the case interview that people often neglect. Having a nice structure for your opening will set you up for the rest of the case. And one of the things that many consulting firms look for is whether you could build a good hypothesis. And this is one of the things that we're going to focus on today. So without further ado, let's jump into it. To begin, there are a few things that you should do for every single case opening. If you've never done an actual case interview, this is what usually happens. You walk into a room with your interviewer, you have a behavioral interview or a conversation for around 15 minutes, and afterwards, your interviewer tells you, okay, it's time for the case. At this point, you probably have some pen and paper in front of you. So when the interviewer starts reading out the prompt, the first thing that you should do is immediately jot down all of the details. This is important because unlike an exam, you will not have access to these details later on unless you write them down. After you've done this, the second thing that you want to do is to repeat the prompt in your own words. This ensures that you have understood the prompt correctly and that you have not missed any important details that the interviewer might have told you. After double checking that your understanding is correct, the third thing that you want to do is to ask clarifying questions. Now, many people don't know exactly what a clarifying question is, and we're here to explain it today. These are essentially questions that clarify any unclear or ambiguous details in the prompt. For example, if the prompt tells you that the client has an e-commerce business, it might be worth asking whether we're talking about B2B e-commerce or B2C e-commerce, as this could make a pretty large difference in your analysis. However, be careful not to ask for any additional information here that is not related to the prompt. If you immediately start asking for information such as the competitive landscape or the customers, you will fall under the trap of having a messy framework. And the conversation will spiral out of your control, and before you know it, you have already failed the case. So remember, in this part, you want to stick to clarifying questions, just questions that are specifically related to unclear details in the prompt. The fourth step is to clarify the objective, if any. And in our opinion, this is the most important step that you have to try to do every single case. As you'll see later when we talk about hypothesis building, the objective is the one part of the case that will drive your direction and approach. This is especially true if there is a specific number linked to the objective, as what you'll need to do beyond that is to calculate whether we could reach that number. And in the unlikely scenario that the interviewer does not provide an objective, what you can do is provide a few possible objectives. For example, if the client is looking to launch a new product, a likely objective of theirs would be to increase their profits. However, know that there's no need to actually assume these objectives. It's much better for you to suggest them and to double check with the interviewer whether you are heading down the right path. The last step of opening a case interview is to build a hypothesis or a framework if applicable. This part is the most challenging part of opening a case, and it's important that you get it right. For McKinsey, Bain, and BCG, they usually expect their candidates to complete this part within a minute, or in difficult cases, 2 minutes. Now, we've coached many coachees over the years, and what we see is that many people struggle with this concept of hypothesis building. This is because the existing material out there does not do a great job in explaining what a hypothesis is. So that's exactly what we're trying to go and do now. In short, a hypothesis is a yes or no statement to be tested and refined through a series of supporting statements. So the first question that you might be asking is, well, when do I need to build a hypothesis? Do I have to build it every single time? And the answer is actually no. Since a hypothesis is a yes or no statement, you only need to build it whenever you have a yes or no question. So if your prompt is this profitable? Should we do it? Then yes, you should build a hypothesis. But on the other hand, if you're doing a brainstorming case where you just have to think of many different ideas, or a customer journey case where you put yourself in the shoes of a customer, then no, you don't necessarily have to build a hypothesis there. Those type of cases tend to be easier, and while you don't need to build a hypothesis, it might still be worth having a framework. For example, if you're doing a customer journey case, one thing that you could do is to build a chronological customer journey. And that sounds fancy, but essentially what it is you're trying to put yourself in the shoes of a customer. For example, if you're talking about the customer journey of a B2C e-commerce platform, what you could do is use your own personal experience of using websites such as Amazon. And to break the framework down, one thing you could do is talk about the customer journey in a chronological order. So in the case of e-commerce, it would be something like planning, searching, purchasing, delivery, and post-delivery. With this structure, you would be able to come up with many ideas for each step of the way and make sure that you don't miss any important points. But back to hypothesis building. Now that you know when to build a hypothesis, the next question is how? The answer is simple. You come up with an initial hypothesis, which is essentially your best guess of what the answer should be. And for the rest of the case interview, you spend a lot of time trying to refine this hypothesis and test whether it's actually true. The aim is that by the end of the case, you would have tested this hypothesis and verified whether it was true or not. If it's true, then great, your initial hypothesis is correct and you can stick with it. If it's false, no worries. You could refine your hypothesis and change it from what it initially was. Now, some of our coaches always ask, how do I come up with an initial hypothesis? The answer is, well, essentially just try to apply your real life knowledge to the case. If a product or a market sounds nice to you, then your initial hypothesis might be that the client should launch that new product or should enter that new market. And vice versa, if a product or market sounds pretty dead to you, then you might want to hypothesize that the client should not enter it. Now, your real life knowledge is unfortunately probably not going to be enough for you to solve the case. So what you need to do is set up a few questions for you to test this hypothesis. This may sound confusing, so let me set up a sample hypothesis just to make it clearer. So in this example, the interviewer asks if our client should launch a new product. Let's call it product X. Immediately, we should be able to build an initial hypothesis, which in this case is yes, our client should launch a new product. Let's call it product X. In order to test this hypothesis, you need a few supporting statements to see if it's true or not. Some common supporting statements is, for example, number one, this could help us achieve our objective. This is a good supporting statement because you know that this is the thing that the client cares the most about. For example, if the client's objective is to earn $100 million in profit for the next year, then you have a specific direction to work towards. You essentially have to calculate whether this product will yield you $100 million in the next year. If it does, then yes, you should obviously launch the product. And if it doesn't, then no, you probably shouldn't launch the product. A second statement that is quite common and could be applied to a lot of cases is that it is a feasible recommendation. This is important because if the recommendation is not feasible, the client wouldn't be able to do it even if it's a good idea in theory. And a potential third statement could be that there are no better alternatives that the client should look into. Within each of these statements, there are more sub-statements that you could be testing that could contribute to whether these statements hold true. For example, if the objective is profit related, you might want to look into profit drivers such as revenue and costs. We'll talk more about these concepts in our next video. For the second statement surrounding feasibility, you might want to look into some operational details. For example, one thing that comes up in many cases is whether you have the enough capital requirements for this decision. Meaning, for example, if I want to launch a new product, I might have to invest millions in the research and development of the product. So without these funds, we would not be able to launch the product in the first place. Other details related to feasibility might be whether there are any regulatory restrictions, whether we have enough human capital or resources to operationalize this decision, and whether would be any resistance from the top management. For example, if the product does not fit into the company's DNA, then the top management might not want to launch this product, even if it's a good idea on paper. And of course, the last thing that you want to explore is whether there are any alternatives for the clients to explore. Now, this statement really depends on the priority of the client. For example, they might be looking for the most profitable solution. They might be looking for the most cost-effective solution, might be looking for the most time-effective solution, or in general, they might just prefer this solution, even if it might not be the best idea. And with this, you have three solid statements that you'll be testing throughout the case, and you have to ask questions strategically in order for you to get the information that you want. Our suggestion is to go through each of your bullet points one by one. So if it's profit, then starting with the revenue drivers and the cost drivers, and then moving on to some implementation details to see if it's feasible, and then finally asking about the board's priorities to see if there are any better alternatives. If you test all of your statements and they come back saying yes, then this is a very good indication that your initial hypothesis is correct. And therefore, you could quite safely recommend this solution to the client. Now, keep in mind that you do not have to follow these three statements for your hypothesis. If you feel that something might be more important, then you should probably fit it in as a statement in your hypothesis. However, if you're a beginner, this is a very good starting point, and I'll urge you to try to practice this framework in your cases. Having said that, our tip of the day is to avoid plugging and pasting frameworks in your approach. If you've read up on business concepts and case interviews, you might have come across numerous frameworks, such as the profitability framework, the 3 C's, and the 4 P's. However, in most cases, if you just throw these frameworks out without thinking about your approach, you will end up wasting a lot of time. And keep in mind, in your interview, you only have around 20 to 30 minutes to get to the right answer. So instead, what you should be doing with these business concepts is to apply them in your hypothesis. How do we do that? Well, if the objective is profit driven, for example, then you might want to look into a lot of revenue and cost drivers. Some of these revenue drivers might be related to competition or customer, which is where your 3 C's framework will come into play. Now, keep in mind that we want to keep our approach as quantitative driven as possible. For example, if we're talking about an objective of $100 million profit, then when you look into the competitive landscape, the question that you really might want to be asking is, how do we capture market share from our competitors? If the market size is big enough and we can capture sufficient market share, then likely our revenues will be high enough. And with a healthy positive profit margin, we will be able to earn this profit of $100 million. To get to this number, you'll probably need other numbers such as the overall market size, the market share, and our profit margin. With this approach, you skipped over all of the other details that you probably didn't need for this case, such as the customer or what sort of promotions we'll be doing. We'll talk a little bit more about frameworks and what concepts you should be applying in our next video. So that's it for today. I hope you learned a little bit about opening the case and hypothesis building, and I encourage you to apply this to your case practice as soon as possible. My name is Adrian, and I'll see you next time.